I don't know if it's a hospitality gene as much as it's a nurturing gene. I think that is really the essence of hospitality, is that you want to give people something that makes them happy, makes them feel good, nourishes them. I think that's more of what I met. I don't know if there's a hospitality gene as much as there's this nurturing gene. And that really, typically, as much as males have nurturing genes, I think really it comes from mostly females and the act of being a parent, being a mother. And I think if I was born with that, I got that from my mother. If I wasn't, I learned it from her. My parents were divorced when I was young. I have 5 siblings, 4 older brothers and 1 younger sister. I was probably, no, I'm sorry. I was 4 or 5 years old when my parents were divorced. So yes, my mother, primarily lived with my mother and my grandmother for a little while as well, and my great aunts. So I was shuffled between very loving, dedicated, committed women. And it was really a wonderful childhood, if you will, with even though I didn't have a father present, I had some great women to help form and focus my childhood. By the time they were divorced, my 2 oldest brothers were already kind of out of the house. They were of age. One of them was off in the Navy. The other one was off on his career, and so there was just the 3 of us, and then along came my younger sister when she remarried. I think that was in 1977. I was working as a young cook in a private club in Narragansett, Rhode Island called the Dunes Club. And I was working for a chef who was, a presence in and of himself. He was a tall, masculine, broad, good-looking Frenchman who was the executive chef of this private club. And during my time working for him, and of course I was just a lowly cook, so I'm not sure why I was having this kind of conversations with him. But the conversations were really about, cooks and our career and our profession. And he said to me one day, he said, Thomas, the reason cooks cook is really to nurture people. And at that moment, that really resonated with me. And I said, wow, I want to become a chef. My father was a Marine, so at the time I was born, he was stationed in Camp Pendleton, which is right near Oceanside in California. And although I was very young, one of the things I do remember about Camp Pendleton, and it is one of the regiments had for a mascot a tiger. And so as a young boy, this tiger was in this massive, well, I don't want to say penned in cage, but just standing there watching this beautiful, elegant, ferocious animal was something that was very captivating. And it was really, it was really about Marines and, their ability to stalk, their ability to be calm, their ability to pounce quickly, and seize their prey. That was something that was fascinating. No, not really. I think that, in our kitchen, though, I think that what we have is really kind of, there's 2 ways of looking at it. I look at it both ways. A sports franchise kind of mentality, as well as a militaristic kind of mentality, because we do have, in the military, you have hierarchy. And I think that's very important, certainly in a kitchen as well as other places in many professions, where there's this instant command response, and that's something that it comes very much from military, and kitchens are run in that way because it's all command response. On the other hand, we look at it as a sports franchise as well. Our job is to mentor and train the next generation of superstars, of franchise players, if you will. Most of the kitchens that I did work in, you always have, the chef, the sous chefs, the chef de parties, the commis, and that's a very hierarchy system where, everybody looks to the chef for the direction, the sous chefs to implement it, the chef de cuisines to perform it, and the commis to support it. right? So that's kind of what that's a system that's been in place since Escoffier codified, a French kitchen, in the early 1900s. A commis is the lowest position that you would enter when you enter a kitchen. When your first job, my first job in a kitchen was as a commis, and I shouldn't say my first job. My first job in a formal kitchen was of a commis, and that's where you're there supporting. You're supporting the chef de partie. A chef de partie is a chef who is responsible for a specific station. So, for example, meat or fish or vegetables or garde manger, which is cold preparation, or pastry. There's a chef de partie in every different station that's in a kitchen. Then you'd have a sous chef. The sous chef is literally under the chef, and a sous chef would be responsible for a couple of different things depending on the role of that sous chef. In our kitchen, for example, we have a sous chef that would be, we call the AM sous chef. So our morning sous chef is responsible for really the beginning of the day and setting the tempo for the rest of the day, which means that he has to work with a lot of the commis, which are typically the youngest, of course, the least skilled, the least experienced. So he has to be able to motivate them. At the same time, he has to be able to maintain the standards of their preparation and also the ingredients that are coming in. So he's tasked with many different things and having to juggle many different things. So the morning sous chef is a very, very important position, somebody that typically has had great experience in the restaurant that he's working in. And then you have other sous chefs which would be responsible for specific groups of chef de parties. So we have a sous chef that's responsible for the meat and the garde manger, and those are his two chefs. So we have a sous chef that's responsible for a canapé and fish, for example. There are sous chefs responsible in pastry in the same way, and then of course the chefs. And so you have a pastry chef who is responsible for the entire pastry station, right? The entire pastry production, the entire pastry service, working with the chef de cuisine on the philosophy of the pastry. And then of course you have the chef de cuisine who is responsible for the entire kitchen. Today we have executive chefs as well. An executive chef would be somebody that would be in a position in a hotel, for example, or where there are many different restaurants, and he would be the executive chef over all of the chef de cuisines from those each different food and beverage outlet, for example. Now remember, chef in France doesn't necessarily relate to the kitchen. A chef in France is the head of a specific area. So you have chef electricians, you have chef plumbers. So it's not just, we relate to chef as somebody that's only in the kitchen, but remember, it's chef de cuisine, chef of the kitchen, chef of the electricians, chef of the plumbers. So typically artisanal work, or work that you're doing with your hands, manual labor, would have a chef. Why I didn't choose to go to school? Because school wasn't really something that was popular or cooking wasn't popular at the time that I became interested. So in the early 70s, when I really started cooking, for me it was really about the process. It was about the engagement with others. It was about that physical activity that was so compelling for me. Working with a group of other young men on a line, in a high stress environment, where it's very intense and you're cooking food. I mean, it's actually performing, and it's a function, and it's physical. The testosterone is raging, and you're with all these. It's a group. It's really, that's where I learned about the idea of it being a team as it relates to a sports franchise. So at that time, cooking wasn't as recognized or as popular as it is today. There weren't a lot of people who had aspirations of becoming a chef. So the schools that we did have were relatively new. Of course, we had the Culinary Institute of America, which began in the mid-40s after World War II. We had Johnson & Wales. We had the Greenbrier, which had a qualified externship program. Of course, there were some schools in France, but they were mostly focused on consumers, mostly housewives on vacation who would want to learn how to cook, as Julia Child certainly when she went to the Cordon Bleu. And so for me, there wasn't really a lot of awareness about opportunities outside of learning the trade in a kitchen. So that's where I chose to go. I chose to go into the kitchen. But it wasn't because I wanted to have a career in the profession, in the culinary profession. It was because of the excitement of working with a team of peers and that physical activity of being on a team. In 1977, I met my mentor, Roland Hennon, who really enlightened me what cooks do. And that's what we do. We nurture people. And that was the moment, July 1977, that I decided to make this my career and pursued that with determination, with commitment. I was already cooking now for 4 years. And still, it wasn't necessarily something that was recognized as a true profession. There was not that many great chefs recognized, other than some of the great chefs of France. In our country, we had very few. We had some in New York City, mostly in New York, I would say, maybe in Chicago, LA a little bit. You started to see little sparks here and there of interest in not just cuisine, but in those who produced it. When my parents were married, my father was typically stationed somewhere else. So, during the Korean War, he was there for 2.5 years. And to keep herself busy, and of course to supply some income for the family, she worked in restaurants. And typically on the base, she would work at the officers club, and as a hostess or waitress, working her way up to understanding how to manage a restaurant. So when they were divorced, that was her path. She became a restaurant manager. And so as a young person, my brother Joseph, who's 18 months older than I, would spend a lot of time in the restaurant, in the kitchen. And he migrated towards cooking much earlier than I did. I remember him watching, he would have the Graham Kerr series. Every day after school, he'd come home and watch Graham Kerr or Julia Child. He was very, very fascinated with cooking. He became a cook. He actually was my first mentor in this profession. And so, we found, I think, a great sense of comfort being in restaurant kitchens. And that's kind of where I found, I don't want to say I found a home, but I found a place where I could feel welcomed. I can feel I have the ability to learn and to kind of expand. At the same time, be able to do my homework when needed, be able to function as a young person and still keep busy. I graduated high school. I spent a little time in college. As I grew older, I realized the benefit of a good education, and I continue to try to educate myself today. But at the time, I wanted to get out into the world. I was very impatient, and I wanted to go out and explore. I wanted to travel. I wanted to see new things. I wanted to try new things. And certainly, the profession that I chose, cooking, allowed me to do all that. I could go anywhere I could go anywhere in the world and be a cook. I studied philosophy, actually. Yeah. I think it's helped me understand and start and analyze what I do, and try to attach other examples of other professions to what I do, and trying to understand it and elevate our profession. Our job as chefs and as restaurant owners today is not just about our restaurants. Of course, we want to make our restaurants better, but our overarching goal is to elevate the standards of our profession, and we do that by training, by mentoring, by giving the skills and knowledge to those next generations, so that they can not only help us in our restaurants, but then go out and be impactful in other restaurants, and of course, hopefully one day open their own restaurants. It's interesting because we all have our own core values, and I think that we can identify them when pressed to define them. We live by them day to day, not necessarily having written them down. And it wasn't until I had an executive coach for a period of time, and he asked me, he said, so Thomas, one of his first questions to me, what are your core values? And it wasn't something that I thought about before. But within a half an hour, I defined what they were, just because that's how I felt, and that's how most people are. Now, our core values can be related to a lot of different people. Some of them defining the same way, others not necessarily, but they understand them. They feel the responsibility to them, and I think that's what makes our culture so strong. Well, I think people take it for granted that we're just cooks in a kitchen, or you're just servers serving food, or you're just sommeliers serving wine. But there is a lot of work, being done, certainly in the past 20, 25 years, that have helped us as a profession to really have an impact, not only on our profession, but on the consumer, and now have an impact on the way our food is being produced, is being grown, is being delivered. And that's a very important thing for us all. The books that I read as a kid were mostly, adventure books, Kon-Tiki, things like that. When I started to cook, the first cookbook that I received was from my mother. It was very interesting because the authors were Vincent and Mary Price. And it was their recipes of the great restaurants that they had experienced around the world. And it was this beautifully leather-bound book. And I'm sure my mother bought it for me because of the quality of the book, not necessarily the quality of the content. So my first culinary disaster was a recipe from this book. And it just goes to show you, at the time, the lack of availability of ingredients in our country. There was a recipe in there, and I can't remember the name of the recipe, but it was a recipe from a very famous restaurant in Italy, and it was, I believe, spinach pasta with prosciutto di Parma, Parmesan cheese, and butter. Very simple. But of course, there was no recipe for the spinach pasta. And of course, at that time, I was very young in my profession. And I said, well, how can I make pasta green? I'll dye it green. So food color came out. We dyed the pasta green. We couldn't get prosciutto di Parma because it just wasn't available in this country. So we used a dried Virginia ham, which was overly salty. Parmesan was the grated kind that you found in the green shaker. It was one of those things that you try. You're trying to prepare a dish without having the proper ingredients, or necessarily even the knowledge of those ingredients, and that really became, for me, a real building block, because I understood that. I understood that if I was going to cook a recipe, if I was going to produce a recipe, I needed to have the correct ingredients. I needed to have the knowledge and the skill in order to prepare it. Otherwise, it wasn't going to be good. It was not very appetizing, but you already made the commitment to do it, right? So you had to follow through, and you had to serve it, and you had to take kind of the feedback, the critical feedback, and just say, okay, yeah, I made a mistake. And really, mistakes are such important building blocks for success. And so that was a mistake I made that I never made again. And I learned from that. I learned that the ingredients were important. I learned the technique was important. I learned skill, knowledge. Where did the dish come from? Why was it produced in that part of Italy? Those things. The second cookbook that I received, which was from my mentor Roland Hennin, was My Gastronomy by Ferdinand Point. Now, Ferdinand Point was, at his time, in his era, which was the 30s and 40s, he was the greatest chef in France, and therefore, of course, the greatest chef in the world. His restaurant was La Pyramide in Valence, in France, and he had great chefs that worked for him. Paul Bocuse was a commis at his restaurant. His book, which was extraordinarily inspiring, was a book of stories. The first half of the book was a book of stories, a book about his restaurant, his experience, his guests, his wife, his team, his chef. And then the second half of the book were recipes, but not recipes like we recognize today. There were no quantities. There was no real technique. It was a narrative. It could be as short as 2 paragraphs. Take the lobster, do this, this, and this, you know, and add this and this, and you have, this is what lobster bohemian is. And it was fascinating because without realizing it, it inspired you to prepare the recipe. And the level of the success or the result of the recipe was based on your current ability. Right? So the lobster bohemian came out the way you interpreted it at that time. A year later, your skills, your experience were increased. And if you made that same dish, it would be different. So in reality, from my point of view and the way I interpret this, is it allowed that recipe to be yours. And he told you in a narrative how to prepare it. You prepared it in the way you could at that time with the ingredients that you had and the knowledge and skills that you had at the moment. And it evolved with you. If you kept after it year after year after year, that dish evolved into something else. Each time you made it, it was yours. It was not necessarily his. And I thought that was just brilliant in the way he wrote that book. The best restaurants were the restaurants that you were aware of. Right? If you picked up a Michelin guide, if you picked up the New York Times, you know, even New York Magazine or any magazine that was either a travel or food magazine, and or had a food section in the newspaper, at that time was always talking about the great restaurants in France and the great chefs. So where else would you aspire to go if it wasn't the best? I mean, if you're going to go to France, which was arguably the best country, had the best food, the best products, the best chefs, the best restaurants, that's what you wanted to do. And so I set my sights high. It took me quite a while to get there. It was about 3.5 years of trying to find somebody in France that was actually going to commit to giving me a job before I actually left America. You know, many times the advice was, "Oh, just go. You'll find a job. Just go over there. Somebody will hire you." I wanted to make sure that I had somewhere to go to. I wasn't convinced that I was just going to travel to France and knock on somebody's door. But in reality, that's actually what happened. Where I ended up having the commitment from was a 1-star Michelin restaurant in Arbois, which is in the Jura, which is in eastern France, just below Alsace. A place I'd never heard about before, a restaurant I'd never heard about, but someone suggested I write them, and I did. And I arrived at the front door, and a large matronly woman, you know, met me, and she was very harsh, and she took me up to my room, which was this small cubicle with a window, but the window was covered with dust, which I thought was dust. And that was my room. It was poorly lit, and I had to arrive at work the next morning in the kitchen downstairs at 5:30, and they would show me what to do. And the kitchen downstairs at 5:30, my first job was to shovel coal into the ovens. And I realized that my window wasn't covered with dust. Well, it was covered with dust, but it was covered with soot, with coal dust. And the kitchen that I was in was nothing like any kitchens that I'd been in America. And I realized that that's not why I came to France. And 3 days later, I packed my bag early in the morning. I snuck out the door, caught the train, and went to Paris. And ended up staying at a friend's apartment for almost 2 years, and literally knocking on people's doors for a job. And fortunately, you know, my persistence paid off, and I had 8 stages, 8 different stages and observation, you know, permission to have an observation in a restaurant. I was a stagiaire, and I was doing a stage, which is, you know, you go into somebody's, it's almost like it's an apprenticeship, if you will. It's an externship, if you will. It's going into someone else's kitchen and actually becoming part of that kitchen. And it's up to that organization or that chef to define what you'll do. So, you know, I did different things in different kitchens because each chef needed a stagiaire in a different way. It was a normal thing. and it still is today. We've reached an interesting crossroads in the stagiaire program because the labor departments need to get involved, and if you have somebody in your kitchen, it's not a learning experience, they're actually working, therefore you have to pay them. It's this whole process, which has really kind of made it really difficult for us to have a proper stash in the kitchen. And it really truly is a learning, a place of learning. And yes, there are some restaurants around the world that would use the stash in an inappropriate way by making him stand in the corner and peel potatoes. That's, for 3 months. But a true stage in a restaurant that has integrity and understands their responsibility and the purpose of a stage gives you a great opportunity to learn. And I have to say that period of my life, that period of my career in France, was so important to who I am today, and really helped me understand a lot of things about running a restaurant that have supported my career and my success. Fortunately, for those 3 years, I was trying to find somebody to commit to giving me a job. I was also, saving my money. And so I had a little bit of savings. My saving grace when I moved to Paris was my friend Serge Raoul, who allowed me to stay at his apartment, so I didn't have rent to pay. You're working in a restaurant, and in France, you work in a restaurant Monday through Friday, and you work, both services, lunch and dinner. So you get to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, you prepare for lunch, you have lunch, you work through service, you take a break at 3, you come back at 5:30, you have dinner, you set up for dinner, then you have dinner, and then you work until 11 o'clock at night. So 5 days a week, I didn't have to, my meals were paid for. I was at work, so I didn't have to spend any money entertaining myself. It was really only on Saturday and Sunday that I kind of had to support myself through eating or eating and or entertaining myself. So it was really, I was in a comfortable position in my living quarters, and I wasn't really spending a lot of money. I mean, entertainment was going to the Beaubourg and taking a French lesson in the audio class downstairs, or going through the museums or walking around Paris. I mean, you're in Paris. There's many ways to entertain yourself without spending a lot of money. It's interesting because at Taillevent, so I'd been cooking for quite some time. When I say quite some time, I went to move to Paris in 1983, so I'd been cooking now for almost a decade. I'd committed myself since 1977 to make this my career, so I've been focused on working and I've chosen French cuisine and haute cuisine as my métier, so I was focused on that. My sites to go to France and work at specific restaurants were already defined, so when I got there, I had a good foundation of technique, a good understanding of classic cuisine, certainly the understanding of the vocabulary in a French kitchen. So I was a little further ahead than some of the other stagiaires that were there, who were much younger than I were, who were more worried about how to make a veal stock or how to turn a vegetable or different things that are basic. That I'd already learned, so I could focus on more of the details, and I was able to do that. And I think that's what made the difference for me, is not having to focus on the foundation of cooking, but be able to understand what made these restaurants great, and understanding that Taillevent, which was probably the single most influential for me, a great restaurant. Was it a restaurant that was breaking new ground? No. Was it a restaurant that was progressive and contemporary? Not necessarily. It was a restaurant that was extraordinarily consistent, and great restaurants have to be consistent. We can all cook. There's a lot of great chefs out there who can do a lot of great things, but to be consistent 300 days a year, lunch and dinner over and over and over and over again, is really, for me, what defines greatness. It's the one-hit wonders or one-hit wonders. To be there for a long time, to be impactful for a long time, to have a team that continues to evolve, to have guests that continue to come to your restaurant, to have that relationship with your partners or your suppliers, Those are really, really important things for me in a restaurant. Restaurants are used in so many different ways. I think that, a restaurant like the French Laundry or Taillevent or any of the great restaurants around the world, and certainly there are many, many, many of them, are restaurants that are experiences. Certainly, yes, you want to go there and you want to have an experience. It's not just about going out to dinner. It's not just about getting something to eat. But I truly don't think that any moment that you get something to eat should just be about getting something to eat. I mean, if you're having dinner, you should be thinking about what you're eating. You should be thinking about those who you're with. I think the single most important thing you can do the single most important decision you make when you're making a reservation to a restaurant is not what restaurant you're going to, but who you're going with. It's that social engagement, that interaction around a dinner table that, to me, is the most important. It truly defines our success. I mean, let's face it. If you're with friends and family, or your partner, and you're having a wonderful time, your experience is going to be elevated because of the time that you're having with the people that you're with. If you're with somebody you don't really want to be with, or there's a problem going on, I mean, your experience is diminished, regardless of what I do. So, I want you to come to my restaurant, with the attitude that you're going to have a great time because of the experience you're going to have with those that you're dining with. My mother passed away, unfortunately, by the time I went to France. My mother passed away in 1982, so I had gone to France in 1983. But my father was, I have to say. Even though I hadn't spent a lot of time with my father growing up, in my early 20s, I made a reconnection with him, and certainly we rekindled our relationship, and he was very supportive of what I did. Even though he didn't understand what I did. He was a Marine. He was, it was always about, for him it was about meat and potatoes. He was a man who would travel 10 miles to save 10 cents on a bar of margarine, not even butter, and then he would buy 20 pounds of it to store in his freezer so that he could have it, whenever he needed it. He was that kind of, came from that kind of generation. He grew up in the Depression, was a Marine for 23 years of his life. He enjoyed nothing more. I think what he enjoyed the most when he would come out here with us and spend the summers here and ultimately moved here, was actually getting in line for dinner with the team every night at staff meal. He liked that. It was camaraderie. It was familiar to him. It was something that made him really comfortable. Raquel was a wonderful restaurant. I think that when I worked at the beginning of that relationship with Serge Raoul, and of course that's where the name comes from, Raoul and Keller, R-A-N-K-E-L. Began in 1985 when I returned from France. I became the first American chef to be at one of the great La Le restaurants in New York City. This was kind of at the end of the era of the La Le restaurants. So you had, at the height of this, you had La Côte Basque, La Caravelle, La Cirque, La Signa, La Reserve, La Périgord. You had all these great restaurants were all defined by that, and so they became the La Le restaurants. And so I became the chef de cuisine of La Reserve, which was on 49th Street. And I came back a bit arrogant, a bit uppity, a bit disrespectful of not my kitchen, but the owner. And so we didn't see eye to eye. And of course, I thought that because of the things that I learned, and because of the ability to execute what I wanted to do, because of my ability to organize a kitchen, I thought that I was invincible. And of course, when you butt heads with the owner, ultimately they're going to throw you out, and that's what he did. I went to work at another restaurant in New York called Raphael, and there's a lot of R's in my restaurant history. And Raphael's was run just like the restaurants ran in France. We were open Monday through Friday. We did lunch and dinner. It was a very small kitchen, and it was a beautiful experience because it was what I related to from just returning from France. I had much more control over it. The owner was more like the owner of the restaurant that I worked at when I was in the Catskill at La Rive, and of course the lunch and dinner in the same day. It really worked for me. At that time, Serge and I started to talk about opening our own restaurant, and that became Raquel. I was working at a restaurant, when I was in South Florida, I was working at a restaurant called the Café du Parc. It was a new restaurant with a chef named Pierre Lachuberne, and Pierre's wife, Anne-Marie. So Pierre ran the kitchen. Pierre was in the kitchen, and Anne was in the dining room. Anne-Marie was in the dining room. And I became his sous chef. And it was a small kitchen. There was him and I in the kitchen with one commis and a dishwasher, and of course Anne-Marie in the dining room with 2 or 3 servers. And it was a wonderful environment, very familiar, very small. We did everything, we did everything from the pâtés to the desserts, and he taught me a great deal. He had a friend, Renee McCary, and his wife Paulette, who owned a restaurant in Catskill, New York, outside of the town of Catskill, New York. And Renee and his wife would come to South Florida in the wintertime because they would close their restaurant. And he was looking for a chef for the following summer, and Pierre recommended me. So I moved to Catskill. A beautiful time in my life. I spent 3 summers there. The second summer, I decided to go to Florida, or I decided to go to New York City to try my hand in Manhattan. And that was when I met Serge Raoul. I became the chef of Raoul's, which was, at the time, an outpost in what became Soho on Prince Street. And it was a classic French bistro in every way. And it was wonderful. I enjoyed it. But the next summer, when spring came around, Renee called me and asked me if I wanted to come back to La Rive. And because that was such a bucolic experience for me, it was so familiar. They were like, it's my second parents. I moved back to Catskill for that 3rd summer. And then, of course, the following summer, I moved to France. We became friends. He recognized, a certain talent in me, and he wanted to open a restaurant with me. So we opened Raquel. Raquel was in an area called Hudson Square in Manhattan, not too far from Soho, not too far from the Village, but an area which was unheard of. And so we found a space there. And this was the area that was going to become the next advertising center of New York City. So Jerry Della Femina moved down there, opened his offices. Saatchi & Saatchi, another huge advertising firm, opened their corporate headquarters down there. Then, of course, I think it was 1988 when we had Black Monday, and that was kind of the demise of that era of spending. And Raquel was in an area that wasn't really supported by a community or neighborhood around it. So we were one of the first restaurants to kind of fail. We converted the restaurant into Café Raquel. I left because I was committed to fine dining, and ultimately moved to LA. And unfortunately, Raquel failed, or Café Raquel failed 2 years later. Actually, it was my second failure in a restaurant. So I learned at that time persistence, is really one of those keys to success. The first, it was an odd name, so don't laugh. It was a restaurant in West Palm Beach, Florida. It was a time before I went to Café du Parc. This was the year before I went to Café du Parc. And I had partnered with two male flight attendants who wanted to open a restaurant. And they had saved their money, and they opened a restaurant called the Cobbly Knob. And the Cobbly Knob has to do with woodworking, because one of our partners was an amateur. It was a hobbyist. It was a woodworking hobbyist. And we thought this location was just like the perfect location. It was on West 45th Street in West Palm Beach, right next door to the Highlight Fronton. Highlight is a sport. And we thought, wow, there's 2,000 people there every night. They're gonna drive right by our restaurant and stop. We're gonna have this instant business. But we were doing at the time fine dining. Now I think it would be casual fine dining. And they wanted hot dogs and hamburgers. They didn't want steak Diane and pomme boulangère. So we lasted about 12 months. And our money ran out, and I left and went to work at Café du Parc. And the poor guys had to kind of lick their wounds and go back to being flight attendants. We all learned a great deal from it. You learn a lot from your mistakes. I learned that I needed to be a lot more responsible to the amount of money I spent on my products and how to use them. We all learned that we had to be aware of the demographics and not just what we wanted to do, but what those around us really wanted to eat. Paul Bocuse said it very well. He said, no matter how good of a cook you are, unless there's people in your seats, you're going to fail. Of course, I read that after we failed. I should have read that before. After Raquel, you know, it was a very difficult time in New York City. Everybody was doing casual dining. Right? That became the catchphrase. You know, everybody wants casual food now. It wasn't so much casual food that they wanted; it was more of a casual price that they really wanted. It didn't matter if you're doing fine dining, family dining. I mean, it was really about the price points. Everybody became more frugal during that time, as they do always in times of uneasiness and disruption in our economic climate. So I stayed in New York for about a year looking for something to do, never really finding anything. I became a consultant, which paid me more money than I ever made before, but which was so unrewarding to do that I was just miserable. And some friends of mine who were very influential in my move were moving to California. And they said, you know, come to California and try it out. At the same time, a gentleman named Bill Wilkinson, who I had a brief conversation with about 4 years earlier. He was opening a hotel in LA called Checkers. And of course, Bill Wilkinson was very influential in the hotel world because he opened the first boutique hotel in our country, which was Campton Place in San Francisco. He was the first hotelier to really bring in a great restaurant with a great chef, and that was Bradley Ogden. And so Bill was then taking his expertise and skill to LA, bought a hotel downtown, renamed it Checkers, and brought in me. And so I became the chef, the second chef there. Jan Birnbaum was the first. I became the chef there and moved to Los Angeles. That didn't last long because Bill pretty quickly sold the hotel to a German company. And of course, there was a real cultural shift for me, and I left. And certainly that became my jumping off point for French Laundry. I began my humble career as a dishwasher. And I'm not sure why my mother allowed, I guess because of age difference, my brother Joseph was allowed to handle a knife, therefore he was allowed to work with the cooks. I was a year and a half younger, therefore I had to be set in front of the dishwasher. I guess it was a much safer position for me. But you know, around the dishwasher, whether it was at that early age or more importantly, when I began to realize that I wanted to cook was at the Palm Beach Yacht Club, and I learned 6 disciplines at the dishwasher, which have, I think, become, you know, a foundation for my career, and I think for many people who aspire to have success in their careers, not just in the culinary profession, not just in the hospitality profession, but in anything. I learned that organization was really important. And organization as a dishwasher really meant that you had to set up a template for the servers to, you know, where to put their dishes. So you always had a bread and butter plate in one spot, a service plate in one spot, a bowl, or whatever the serviceware was. You had a piece set up on the counter, on the drain board, where they were supposed to put it. You had your different areas for your knives, your forks, your spoons, things like that. Of course, you had your glass racks for specific racks. So that organization aspect allowed you to be more efficient, which was kind of the second discipline that I learned, is efficiency was really, really key into doing things well. If you could be more efficient than the person next to you, then you could have more time to learn what you wanted to learn to continue to grow and continue to evolve, continue to progress. So efficiency became important. You know, how you lined up the racks, you know, how you put the plates in the racks, or when was the time to wash the glasses, when was the time to wash the silverware so that everything became seamless for everybody. Feedback was the third discipline. If you didn't properly rinse or stack or sort the silverware or the dishes correctly, and you put them in the dishwasher, a minute and a half later when the machine opened, they would still be dirty. And so that was immediate critical feedback. You knew when you did a bad job and you knew when you did a good job. And you know what? It was okay, either one. You learned from the mistake of doing the bad job, that you learned that you needed to either stack your dishes differently, rinse them differently, sort the silverware differently, or whatever it was that critical feedback taught you. That's what you needed to do. So you modified your behavior to be successful. Of course, if you were successful, then it was positive feedback and you knew that you did a good job. And no one told you those things. You realized them on your own, and that was really important as well. Of the fourth discipline I learned was the repetition, right? I don't want to say the art of repetition, but the ability to respect repetition and embrace it. We're cooks. We do the same thing over and over and over and over again. So if you don't want to be repetitive in what you're doing, you probably don't want to really be a cook. Learn how to cut brunoise, learn how to peel an onion, learn how to slice. All these things that are part of that repetition was what I learned at the dishwasher, because at the dishwasher you do the same thing over and over and over and over again. I learned the importance of ritual, doing things at specific times of the day and having leading up to those times and being prepared for those times. You had to change the water in the dish machine every 2 hours. You had to check the soap every 3 hours. You had to empty the garbage can 3 times a day. You had to sweep the floor, at these specific times. You had to do different things at different times of day, which were part of the ritual of your job. And rituals are very, very, very important. And the last, not any more important than the others, was the idea of teamwork and embracing that. You as a dishwasher, even though you may have been perceived as the lowliest position in a kitchen, you touched everybody, and your job was critical in their ability to be successful. You had to deliver the dishes back to the chefs, right? So they could plate the food. You had to have the silverware to the servers so they could set the tables. You had the glassware to the bartenders so they could do their job. So everybody relied on your ability to be organized, to be efficient, to have your job done thoroughly, to understand repetition, rituals, and give them what they needed to do the job. And those 6 disciplines are what we do every day as cooks. And I embraced that, I understood it. I didn't recognize it until much later in my career, but I realized it, and I understand that was part of the foundation of why I became a good cook, and ultimately was able to become a good chef. I started to embrace the idea of doing things myself outside of the kitchen, having a garden. Right? So at La Rive, which was a beautiful old farm on the side of a small creek, I planted my first garden. La Rive was outside of Catskill. I spent 3 summers there, 80, 81, and 82. And so in 1980, I planted my first garden. I understood that there was a lot of competition, because not only did I want the vegetables, so did the deer, and so did the beavers, and so did any other wildlife that would come into the fray. And I learned how to share with them. So I gave them some, and I took some. But gardening became part of my life. I learned that doing things that other people do better is not necessarily good just because you're doing it in your own backyard or in your own house. So this idea of smoking your own salmon, or this idea of making your own ketchup, which was really popular, at this period of time, didn't necessarily result in something that was better than the guy in Scotland whose family has been curing and smoking salmon for generations. But nonetheless, I built my own little smoker out of an old refrigerator, and cured and smoked my own salmon. I was also developing my relationship with farmers, with foragers, with gardeners, with fishermen from around the area. And there was one farmer who supplied me with my rabbits every week. It was a Frenchman, and he would bring me 12 rabbits, beautifully dressed, every week. And one week I thought, I'm going to ask him to bring them live, because as a chef, I should really know what it feels like, and of course, how to slaughter an animal. And, what better animal to slaughter than something that is relatively small? Go out and slaughter a cow, or a pig would have maybe been a little more emotionally disturbing. But slaughtering a rabbit may be something that I could handle. So, of course, the next week he showed up. He's got his cage. There's 12 rabbits in the cage. And he's explaining to me in broken English, how to kill the rabbit. And the first and most important thing he said was to make sure that when you reach into the cage, that you grab both the hind legs simultaneously. So he reaches in the cage, pulls the rabbit out, both legs, has one of those little baseball clubs, knocks it on his head, pins the rabbit to the side of the barn, slits his throat, dresses the rabbit in about 5 minutes. He's gone. Well, wow, what just happened? I'm looking at this rabbit hanging on the side of the barn, and 11 rabbits in the cage. And now I'm left, because now I have to, without his help or his guidance, is butcher these other 11 rabbits. And of course, I make the critical mistake of only being able to grab one of the hind legs of the rabbit. Of course, what does the rabbit do? It jumps, right? Its reaction is to jump. And of course, when it tries to jump forward, I'm holding a leg. What happens? I break its leg. The rabbit screams. I mean, it was just, it was such an emotional experience. I didn't know what to do. The rabbit screamed so loud that Paulette, the wife of the owner, came out of the house. Their house was just, maybe 50 yards away, thinking something had happened. And now I've got this rabbit that's got a broken leg, and I've got to kill it and dress it. And not only that, I've got to do the other 10. And I learned at that moment a profound respect for the ingredients that we have, a profound respect for those individuals who bring them to us, and how committed they are to what they do, and how committed I have to be to what I'm doing to respect what they do. And, waste became a really important part of that learning experience, making sure that, that rabbit, which gave up its life, I had to make sure that I utilized it in the best way I could, and every bit of it, and make sure that I paid attention to how I cooked it. To cook something and overcook it and then just throw it away would be just a waste of life. And so it just didn't go with our proteins. It went with everything, because every ingredient that we receive in our restaurants, or you receive at home as a consumer, somebody has spent part of their life producing that for us, and we have to be respectful of that, and make sure that we were able to nourish ourselves with the food that they supply us. And that, the rabbit story was that profound moment in my life where I learned that really deep sense of respect for everything that we have coming through our back doors. It was interesting because when I wrote the French Laundry Cookbook, it was an important story for me to tell. And of course, it's such an uncomfortable story for a lot of people that my publisher didn't want to include it in the book, and I made her. And of course, it became one of those stories that, if it was today, it would have gone viral. But back in those days, we didn't have what we have today. But the Gourmet magazine picked it up, and they thought it was very important. They ran it in one of their last issues. So. In 1992, I visited the Valley from Los Angeles. I wasn't doing anything. I left Checkers. I was unsure of my career. I had now failed in 2 restaurants and a chef de cuisine position, or executive chef position at Checkers Hotel. I'd moved to a new community, didn't really know anything about the community, felt very uncomfortable. Again, trying to find a home, trying to find a place where I could really embrace and be the chef. I was questioning my ability as a chef. I knew I could cook. Cooking wasn't the question, but could I lead a team better? Could I interact better with those around me who influence our restaurants? Not just in the kitchen, but in the management positions and in the ownership positions, everywhere that I kind of struggled in the past. The kitchen was my comfort zone, and I was very successful in the kitchen, but outside of that, I wasn't so much so. And on a trip to Napa Valley, one spring day. Jonathan Waxman, who was a friend of mine, who had opened a restaurant in New York, and now is opening a restaurant here in Napa Valley. I stopped to see him, say hello, see how he was doing. And he had told me about this small restaurant in Yountville for sale called the French Laundry, and I should look into that. He thought that would be the perfect kind of place for me. Small, manageable, in a beautiful community here in Napa Valley. So I passed by out of curiosity, and I walked on the property. It was this kind of this magical place, you know, and I just felt an instant connection to it. And I thought, wow, this may be a great opportunity for me, maybe my last chance. I was in my mid-30s. I thought, you know, if I'm going to do this, I need to do it now. And I went back to Los Angeles. I got in contact with the owners, Don and Sally Schmidt. I explained my intentions. They invited me up to meet them. I came up. I remember she served me on that day. She served me one of the best sandwiches I ever had, which was beef tongue. We sat in their kitchen in their house next door. We made an instant connection, and we agreed on a price, and I was now going to buy the French Laundry. Of course, I didn't have any resources whatsoever. I didn't have a job. I'd already closed 2 restaurants. I'd been fired from another. I was a semi-well-known chef with a I guess a checkered reputation, and now I needed to go out and raise the money to buy this restaurant. I was in an area where in California. I was in Los Angeles. I didn't really know that area that well. I'd only been there for a year, but I was determined. I was committed. If I was going to make a career, if I was going to be successful in my chosen vocation, I needed to raise this money. I needed to commit myself to doing something I'd never done before. And I always say my biggest asset at the time was my ignorance. Had I known everything that I was going to have to do over the course of the next 18 months, I would have given up right away. It was such a daunting, such a daunting task, the things that I went through. But each day, you know, waking up, each day finding some success kept me motivated to the next day. The Schmidts, lovely people, had agreed to sell me their restaurant for $1.2 million. They agreed to take $5,000 in escrow. They believed in me. Had they not, I wouldn't be here today. An attorney in Los Angeles named Bob Sutcliffe, who I was introduced to by way of Joachim Spichau. Bob was an attorney who did on the side restaurant deals. He loved food, he loved wine, he loved chefs, so he worked with a couple chefs in helping them raise money, you know, organize their businesses. So, you know, I went to Bob's office with this idea of the French Laundry, and hoping that he would be my attorney. Now, before I went to see Bob, you have to realize that I had worked on this business plan, right? And there was another friend of mine in Los Angeles who taught me how to use a computer. There was a friend here in Napa Valley who was a banker turned vintner, who helped me with finances, who helped me with putting together the financial component of the business plan. So when I went to see Bob Sutcliffe, I had a 300-page business plan and a bottle of olive oil. And this olive oil was a small olive oil company I began to kind of keep me solvent in some ways, but also keep me motivated, keep me busy, and have kind of, I wouldn't even call it a plan B, maybe it was a plan D as an olive oil purveyor. And so I went to talk to Bob, and I gave him this whole spiel about the French Laundry, and, you know, here was my business plan. And he said, okay, this is how much it's going to cost you. And I said, you know, Bob, I really don't have any money, but I have this olive oil. I put this olive oil on his desk, and I told him about this olive oil and what I was doing with it and the French Laundry and all this. And for some reason, he said, okay, Thomas, you know, I believe in you. But I need something. So, you know, if you can give me $5,000, then I'll take on the project. And, you know, if it's successful, you know, we'll take our money on the back end. I said, great. So for the next 2 weeks, I went to the ATM machine, and on my credit card, I took out $500 until I got $5,000, and I took $5,000 in cash and gave it to him, and he started to modify the business plan and produce a bona fide business plan that I could then present to partners, which we did. And every morning there was a ritual where I would wake up and I would call, my list of people, asking them for money. Hello, my name is, I have this idea of, and I'd like you to consider it. Can I send you a copy? Right? And so that was over 400 people I called during that period of time. Out of those 452, agreed to write a check for a lot of different reasons, from any amount of money. I think one of my investors invested 500, and the one who invested the most, I think, was 80,000. So you can see there was a wide range of investment. I wanted to have a large group of people because of my experience at Raquel. Serge was my only investor, so his life was impacted by the failure of Raquel. I said, I'm never going to do that again. If I'm going to raise money, I'm going to raise money from a lot of different people, so it doesn't impact it. If I'm not successful, it's not going to impact their lives. So that was the process with the private placement business plan. On my makeshift desk I clipped out of the New York Times during this period of my life. There was an article which was titled, "Having a dream is hard, living it is harder." And that became my inspiration every morning, because I had a dream to buy the French Laundry, but now I had to actually act on it, that dream, and make it reality. And so living that dream became one of the hardest things I've ever done, but also one of the most gratifying things I've ever done in my life. My ignorance, as I said earlier, just continued to motivate me, to propel me forward. The successes motivated me and propelled me forward. The ignorance allowed me to do it. But not only did I have to raise money from private partners, I had to buy the property. So we had to have a commercial bank loan. So I went to different banks, several banks. All of them loved the idea, but turned me down. Turned me down primarily not because there wasn't value in the property, but because I had a tax lien in New York City. And this tax lien was based on our failure at Raquel. So I had to go back to Serge, because I didn't have any money, and had to ask Serge to satisfy the tax lien, which my portion of it was considerable. And he agreed to do it. So he wrote a check to the New York tax authorities to clear us up, which allowed me to get a bank loan. Not only did I get a commercial bank loan, I also went to the Small Business Administration, because I was still short on money. And of course, as a white, middle-class, educated American, I wasn't on the top of the list of somebody the SBA was going to give money to. Yet at that time, Bill Clinton was just inaugurated, became our president, and one of his goals was to fund the SBA and try to get small businesses to be thriving again. So at that right moment, in that right period of time, I was able to put my application in and be approved for an SBA loan. So between private placement, commercial bank loan, and an SBA loan over the period, and with the help of Don and Sally Schmidt and Bob Sutcliffe, my attorney, as well as the 52 partners, we were able to put together enough money to buy the French Laundry. May 1st, 1994, we finally closed on the deal. In the beginning, when Don and Sally Schmidt had the restaurant, there was one menu. It was in the era of Chez Panisse. The French Laundry was open, almost at the same time that Alice Waters opened Chez Panisse. So it was one menu every day. It changed. Whatever the seasons brought, whatever the vegetables were. It was a 4-course menu that changed every day. And so when I was doing my research and asking people in the Valley what they thought about the French Laundry, they all loved it. It'd been here for a long time. It'd become part of the fabric of restaurants in Napa Valley, certainly of Yountville. And one thing they said, it's not open enough. They were only open 4 days, and there's no choices on the menu, so it's a problem for us. So I thought, well, when I open the French Laundry, we'll extend hours of operation, and we'll offer choices in each category. We'll offer a 4-course menu and a 5-course menu. So we started out with a menu that had up to 7 or 8 choices in each category. So we were producing, if it was 5, we were producing 40 items, 40, 45 items a day. And that became part of our, and it changed. Not every day. We changed every day. Not everything changed every day, but the menu changed every day. It was part of our culture, part of our philosophy, part of the philosophy that we had embraced from Don and Sally Schmidt. As time went on and we became more and more popular, we realized that we realized that we wanted to add a tasting menu. So we added a vegetable menu, which was 7 courses, and we added a tasting menu, which was 9 courses. So now we increased our production from 40 items to 60 items. It was a daunting task for us every day to produce this menu. And as time went on, we realized that we started selling more and more tasting menus. And so in conversations with the dining room, the course of a person's experience there was they would come in and they would ask. They finally got into the French Laundry. It was a great, it was a wonderful moment for them. They didn't want to make the wrong choice. So they would ask the captain, so what should I eat tonight? Well, we have this and we have this. And so 80% of the guests were choosing the tasting menu. So it just became a natural evolution for us to do away with the 5-course menu, because 80% of our guests were choosing the 9 courses and 20% were choosing the 40 others. So for us, we just started to focus on the tasting menu. And it became the 2 tasting menus, the vegetable and the menus with the proteins. We talk about luxury, right? So we think about luxury in differently now. We used to think about luxury as choices, right? The more choices you had, the more luxurious it was. Wow, I could choose, you go to a hotel and you had 6 pillows to choose from. It's like, wow, I could choose any one of these pillows, but which one really is the best? You don't know. You got, well, which one do I want? It creates an anxiety in you, actually. So when you go into a restaurant like the French Laundry and you have to make a choice, it's like, what do I choose, right? What does the chef think I should choose? People become very anxious in those moments. And luxury to me is not having to make a choice. Having somebody guide me through an experience that's going to result in something that is memorable. And that's how we define success, as giving people those memories. So our job is to make sure that we're choosing those ingredients of the moment. We're composing our dishes in a way that are going to be compelling for people. But we also have the ability to modify anything we do for somebody who has a dietary restriction or who just doesn't like something. We have to be able to give them options, but restrict their initial choice to something that we believe they would enjoy. And so that's what we do. We try to limit the choices, relieve the anxiety, and give somebody an experience that then when they leave the restaurant, it's memorable. It's pretty extraordinary when someone with the capacity, with the authority, with the attention that Ruth is able to get says that you're the most exciting place to eat in America. I mean, it changes your life, of course. And so we were very, of course, flattered. We were very honored. But more so than any of that, we realized a great burden of responsibility. Because Ruth, who is an expert in her field, somebody who we all look to, somebody who we all respect, has now called us, literally the best place or the most exciting place to eat in America. How do we respond to that? We respond to that by notching up our game. We have to really be that much more determined, that much more committed to what we do every day, every dish. We have to be thinking about in a way that when someone comes in is going to relate that experience to what Ruth said. Because now your expectations as a guest have become greater. I know from a personal experience how your expectations can actually diminish an experience. My first 3-star experience in France was just like that. I had been reading about this restaurant for years. It was considered one of the best restaurants in the world. The chef was highly regarded, 3 Michelin stars. I mean, extraordinary chef. And I went to his restaurant, had lunch on my way to Arbois. And I left thinking, wow, what's so great about that, right? He served me pigeon and peas with morel mushrooms. We had a beautiful foie gras to start, and we had, I forget the dessert. And I realized 3 or 4 months later that it was a perfect meal. And it was my expectations that got in the way of my experience. This was my first 3-star restaurant, and I walked in there thinking that, I don't know what I was thinking. I was thinking that, I don't know, fireworks, I don't know, whatever. And it just didn't happen. But in retrospect, it was beautiful. The pigeon was beautiful. The peas were just so perfect. The morel mushroom, everything was just right. And I didn't appreciate it. And expectations do get in the way. So we have to, our expectations in our kitchen, in our restaurant, in our service, everything that we do, we have to understand that our expectations have to be of the highest. The highest priority for us is that we are able to reach our own expectations. And if we do that every day, then that's the best we can do. And we can feel comfortable that we have given you the best. And if you appreciate it, great. If you don't, then we've only failed you, we haven't failed ourselves. And that's an important thing for us to remember. You know, Ruth Reichel's article, as important as that was, there was an article prior to that, which very few people recognize or realize, but there was, at this time, newspapers still had a social columnist, okay? And in San Francisco, we had Herb Caen. Herb Caen was a great writer. He knew San Francisco in and out. He wrote a social column every day. Herb Caen came to dinner at the French Laundry, and Herb always wrote maybe two or three sentences about an experience he had that he wanted to share. He had dinner at the French Laundry, and he wrote 3 paragraphs about the French Laundry. Now, people who are interested in food and wine, they'll read the food section of the New York Times, or the Chronicle, or the LA Times, or any newspaper. They'll pick up Bon Appetit magazine, or Gourmet, or Savoir, or any of the magazines. They'll pick up the food guides. Everybody read Herb Caen, whether you liked food or not. Everybody. So that was really the beginning for us of our success in Northern California. And of course, that catapulted us to, again, be financially successful, which allowed us now to commit our resources in so many different ways. We built our new kitchen. We were able to expand our staff. I mean, we did so many different things. We opened Bouchon. Yeah. So it was really, you know, at each moment there's these important. Every moment's important, and as important as Ruth's was, Herb's was the same. The Schmidt's, the story of the French Laundry, for me, is just an incredible story, because everybody who was part of that process, who was part of that evolution, who was part of that project, has impacted it in so many different ways. Michelin announced that they were going to come to America. It just shocked us all. We had never, when I say we, I'm talking about the community of chefs who've always aspired to be of that quality, not necessarily ever achieving those stars, but to be of that quality. how could we be worthy of a Michelin star or two? Forget about three. That was going to be something that was maybe decades away. Michelin was coming to America, and we didn't know what was going to happen. Who was going to receive 1 star, 2 stars, 3 star? Where was their parameters for that? Who was going to be their inspectors? Of course, we never knew who their inspectors were, but who were their inspectors? Were they going to come from France? Were they going to be Americans? All this was a mystery until the day that you got a phone call. And Michelin's first launched in New York City, so per se was in the forefront of that first launch in New York. Per se opened in 2004. Michelin came in 2006, and it was interesting because at the time of the announcement, Laura and I were in France for I believe it was a Traditions and Qualité conference, which is a French association that we belong to. And we had a choice of getting on an airplane and missing the phone call because it was going to come at 10 o'clock in the morning New York time, which was 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Paris. We would have been on a flight, so we would have missed the phone call. Or we could stay in Paris, maybe get a phone call, but miss the celebration in New York. So we chose to stay in Paris because the phone call would have, to miss a phone call as being one of the first Michelin-starred restaurants in America, being one of the first American chefs to receive potentially a Michelin star, would have been too much of I think of a moment in my life that I'd want to give up. So of course, it wasn't going to come until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So we had all day to walk around and just, kind of try to patiently wait. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we were on the West Bank in front of one of the department stores over there, I think, Sumatran or one of the great department stores of Paris. And the phone rings. And it's Jean-Luc Naret, who was the director of Michelin. And he said, Thomas, I want to be the first to congratulate you. You have received there was a pause. You've received the highest rating in Michelin, 3 stars. And I was just, I was like, it was an emotional moment. I caught my breath and I said, of course, I thanked him very much. And I said, one of the things that I want to assure you of is, again, it's great to achieve this recognition, but now it's our responsibility to make sure that the guests that come to our restaurant have that experience. And I want you to know that we're committed and dedicated to this honor, to this award, to this achievement, and we'll do our best to maintain the reputation of a 3-star restaurant in America. And then we were left with, where are we going to celebrate? What are we going to do? We just received 3 stars. Of course, we called the restaurant. There was jubilation. The restaurant was per se in New York. Jonathan Bennett was our chef at the time. I said, Jonathan, you're the first chef de cuisine. I'm the first chef owner. This is truly, an extraordinary moment in American culinary history. We are the first American chefs in America to receive 3 stars. So I thought, what better place to celebrate than Taillevent? My first 3-star work experience. So I called Taillevent, and of course, Jean-Claude Brunet said, please, welcome, come over. And we went, and it was an amazing moment to be able to walk into Taillevent, which had such a profound impact on my career, on my philosophy, on the culture that we have, on my skills, on everything, on my life. And to be able to walk into that restaurant as the first American to receive 3 Michelin stars, and be embraced by Mr. Vernet, who I have, until the day he died, have had such a profound respect for. And he set us down right at the first table. We had an extraordinary dinner. He actually sat with us, and his wife Sabine told me as we were leaving, she said, I've never seen my husband ever sit down with anybody in this restaurant. He sat with us for about 5 minutes and chatted. It was just one of those magical moments. We got on a plane the next day and came back to New York and, of course, celebrated again. The following year, Michelin was going to launch in San Francisco. Again, we don't know what to expect. I mean, we're the mothership. You know, we're the foundation of Thomas Keller Restaurant Group, and certainly the inspiration for Per Se. We can only hope that we can achieve that. And Jean-Luc Naret was coming to San Francisco himself because he wanted to have an after party, celebrate to introduce the Michelin Guide in 2007. And he flew in from Paris with 4 other executives from Michelin, and they had dinner at the French Laundry. And so there were 5 of them. And about midnight, he finished about midnight, and he came back to the kitchen, and I was standing in the box in our little office in the kitchen chef's office, and I was cleaning, doing my nightly cleaning rituals. And you know, he came in, he snuck in, he said, "I just want to tell you, you're going to get a phone call tomorrow, and you're going to be really happy." So I went home, I took a shower like I normally did, and I came back to the restaurant, I gathered everybody around, and I said, "You know, I think we're going to have a great day tomorrow." So we opened a glass of champagne, and of course the next morning, he called me, and he told me that French Laundry, again, had received the highest recognition from Michelin Guide, 3 stars. Again, I told him, you know, how proud we were of that, and now it was our responsibility to make sure that we lived up to the reputation. And he said, "Oh, and by the way, Bouchon got 1. Those were 2 of the greatest moments of my life, and to have that, you know, it's still hard to believe that, you know, we are considered on the same level as those great restaurants in France that have inspired me and so many of my colleagues and so many others to try to achieve greatness. One of his favorite things was to do was to sit in the parking lot early in the morning when our purveyors would bring their deliveries in, and he would always tell me he would save me $1 on a basket of strawberries, or he would be able to, you know, to get an extra couple quarts of milk, you know, and he was always the kind of guy who wanted to save money, and so he was very proud to be able to talk to our suppliers and get them to either give us extra or reduce our price. And he was always the one who was out there getting reservations for the restaurant. People walking around town, you know, he would just chat people up and, "Oh, you know, my son owns a French Laundry," and they would say, "Oh, can you get me a reservation?" "Oh, no problem." So we're always trying to fill the books in with his reservations. But I think his favorite thing to do was really to share time, share moments with the young staff, and just tell stories. He was a great storyteller. And his house was right next door to the French Laundry where he lived, and it was a common thing to go over there, you know, after work in the afternoon at 4 or 5 o'clock when the morning team would be finishing up, and they'd be over there on his front porch drinking beer out of cans because he really liked canned beer as opposed to bottled beer. Those were things that he was familiar with. So, and just telling stories, and they would just be, you know, they were 50 years younger than he was, you know, and he would just be telling them stories, and they'd just be like listening, you know, on the edge of their seats. And that was one of the favorite things that he did. We did. It was, you know, of course you never know those things when you're doing it. You're only doing it because, you know, because you love the person and because you're responsible to the person and because, you know, that's what you do. That's what, you know, that's just what you do, you know. Yeah. And, you know, he wanted to have the chicken, barbecue chicken, and, you know, so we made him barbecue chicken and, you know, cooked up some mashed potatoes because that's what he wanted, made him a strawberry shortcake for dessert, and that's what he wanted. And you never know. I mean, that was a Sunday supper, and, you know, we had a beautiful time with my oldest brother was here at the same time. We had a beautiful time on the back porch of our house, and, you know, that Monday night, the next night, he passed away. But it's, you know, you just never know. I think that's just it. I think it's discipline. I think that's, you know, what the Marines say so much about it is that discipline, is that commitment to what you're doing, and more important, the commitment to each other. And that's what really we want to be able to instill, to teach our young staff, is that, you know, the person standing next to you is your colleague. He's that person that's going to support you, that's not going to let you fall, and don't let him fall. And really, it's a team, and we're all in it together, and we all have to support one another. We're committed to one another. We're dedicated to one another, and the success of you as an individual is really based on the success of the team. Well, we love to do Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving is one of those moments that's truly about that experience around the table, that family, friends. And, it really goes back to when I was a young child, and that was one of the meals my mother would cook, would be Thanksgiving. And she would spend, it seems like days, preparing Thanksgiving dinner. It's a small four burner stove with one oven. It takes you a long time to prepare dinner. But it was such a wonderful moment that lasted for days afterwards because you had all the leftovers. And so when we started to think about Thanksgiving here at our restaurant at the French Laundry when we first opened, we started thinking about that, serving that kind of meal, which was a meal that allowed you to interact with it. In other words, you carved the turkey, you served the food, and then you took the leftovers home. As we continued to evolve with that idea, we realized that the veterans here weren't having that kind of experience. And so we committed ourselves to doing that. So on Thanksgiving Day at Bouchon, that's what we do. We invite those from our veterans home here in Yountville down to experience a meal around a table in a familiar place with food that is nourishing in every way. We want to make sure that we pay respect to them, and it's one of our. We also support the Semper Fi Foundation, which is actually in Camp Pendleton. One of the things that I don't believe we do enough of is to help our veterans, our servicemen and women. Mentor is, it's interesting because, again, these things have happened in my life kind of by coincidence or by some divine plan. I'm not sure which one. But Paul Bocuse, who has been an icon in our profession, someone who I've always looked up to, somebody who changed the way our profession is perceived, somebody who's changed the way we eat, literally changed the way we eat, started a competition, international competition, 28 years ago, to bring the world together on an international level for a culinary competition that resulted in relationship building, in teaching, in awareness, in camaraderie, and helping to expand the awareness of our profession around the world. America had competed since the beginning, but never even came close to the podium. Very few people in our country even knew that there was an American culinary team representing our country in Lyon every 2 years at this competition of 23 other nations. Paul Bocuse, who has a great affection for America, when he was a young man in the French Resistance, being wounded and being taken to an American military hospital, American Field Military Hospital, and be given a blood transfusion. And he'll tell the story that he is part American because he has American blood running through his veins. And he flies the American flag above his restaurant. Of course, his son went to school here in the Culinary Institute of America and now lives in America. His grandson is American. He wanted America to have a better representation at the Bocuse d'Or. So he called his son, who then called his best friend, Daniel Baloud, who called me and said, the three of us are going to form a foundation to support the competition, to support the U.S. team in competing in France. Danielle said, Paul's going to call you in 10 minutes and ask you to be the president. You're an American. We have to have an American president. I said, okay. So sure enough, Paul calls me 10 minutes later and asks me to be the president. And what do you say to Paul Bocuse? What do you say to any chef? You never say no to the chef, right? It's always we, chef. Yes. So I said, yes, chef. And so that began the day of our quest to get on the podium. We all promised him that we would do our jobs collectively in organizing a foundation that would support a U.S. culinary team to compete in Lyon and actually reach the podium. Our first year was 2009. We sixth place. Was a young chef from the French Laundry, Timothy Hollingsworth. Our second challenge was in 2011. We fell to 10th. In 2013, we raised to 9th. In 2015, we finally reached the podium. The first time the Americans have ever been on the podium in France. We won silver. Philippe Tessier, who was a young chef, our sous chef at French Laundry, formed the team and made the challenge. And we were so proud. It was such a moment for us because we represented our country. In the same way that our U.S. Olympic athletes represent our country, we feel the same way in our profession. It's not everybody knows it like that. Not everybody has that much awareness of it. But for our point of view, the sense of national pride that we have in what we do, the commitment that we have during that 2-year process of training, choosing and training those young chefs, because it takes a year to train them. The commitment they make to doing the same, talk about doing the same thing every day. I mean, that's it. It's so repetitive. They're working on the same preparation, the same compositions, the same dishes, the same recipes, day in and day out for that entire year period. And then going to France, and in a 5.5-hour period, producing those 2 proteins and serving it to 24 international judges. It's an extraordinary event, extraordinary undertaking. It's the stamina, the commitment, the dedication to the craft is unparalleled. And to reach the podium for the first time, Danielle, Jerome, and I felt that we had finally been able to give Paul what we promised. It was the Americans on the podium. And it was fascinating, and again, certainly we were very proud and honored. The next day in the Lyon newspaper, the headlines, Paul's dream realized, America reaches the podium. We got silver. So it's bronze, silver, and gold. But it wasn't about the team that won gold. It was about Paul's dream realized, America reaches the podium. And so I am in his restaurant the next day, because every morning after the competition, he does a breakfast for the winners. And we're watching Philip's name being inserted into the walkway that leads up to the front door. The first time ever, Philippe Tessier, USA. Every year, there's now 13 rows of silver, gold, or gold, silver, bronze plaques with people's names on them. First time USA is there. I'm standing at the pass in Paul's kitchen. I'm standing next to him, and I'm just telling him how proud I am, how much I love what he's done, how much I love him. And we finally achieved what we promised, to reach the podium. And he looks at me with a smirk in his eye and says, gold. So he's still pushing. As much as he was satisfied, he says, you're not quite there yet. You got one more to go. Well, I think the American dream is, what it means to me is everybody in our country has an opportunity. And all you have to do is believe in yourself, be patient, be persistent. Never let anybody tell you that you can't do something. Prove that you can by acting on it, and you'll be successful. I think that kind of sums up my life and what I've been doing. I could only hope for the next 20 years that I'm able to continue to dedicate and commit myself on a different level to our profession and to my teams, and continue to offer them the ability, the platform to elevate themselves. We are only as good as those who come after us. One of our primary jobs, one of our primary responsibilities is to hire the right people, make sure that the people that we're hiring, those individuals, young men and women, are of the right attitude, of the right mindset, have the right skills to enter into our profession. We have to give them training. And that training goes on not for 2 weeks or 2 months, but that training goes on their entire time that they're with us. And then we have to mentor them, not just in their career, but in their lives. And if we do those three things right, what happens? They become better than you. And if they're not better than you, then you haven't done a very good job. I've had some extraordinary honors in my life. I've achieved things that I could never even dreamed of. And certainly receiving the Legion of Honor from President Sarkozy was beyond anything I could ever dream of. And I really have to thank those who nominated me, Daniel Boulud, Paul Bocuse, Jerome. In the process, I wasn't really privy to the process that you go through, but I remember receiving the letter from the president of France telling me that he was proud of the work that I've done in my field and that I deserved to be recognized by the people of France, and to receive the Médaillon de Légion d'honneur was their way of expressing their gratitude and asking me if I would like to be hosted at the Élysée Palace in Paris later that year to receive the medal from him, or to receive the medal from an officer of the Mérite Légion d'honneur that was of a higher rank than I was. And it wasn't a difficult decision for me, as much as I would have appreciated and certainly had deep respect to go to France and receive it at the Élysée. I knew right away that I would prefer to have somebody else pin that medal on my chest. And it was, again, a coincidence that Paul Bocuse was going to be in America that March or that April, and I could have him pin the medal on my chest. So we had a gathering at Per Se in New York, where we invited the ambassador from France, who came, and a lot of my colleagues, of course, Danielle, Jerome, Alain Ducasse was there, Jean-Georges Van der Richten, and it was a great celebration. And of course, he was the one who took the medal out of the box and pinned it on my chest, and it was one of the most, I think, extraordinary moment in my life to receive that kind of recognition from a country that has defined for me what great cuisine is. There are two chefs that came out of that period. Alice Waters was one of them, who really kind of defined what California, not California cuisine, but the products and the diversity and the quality of products and how important that is and where they come from. And that was certainly something that resonated with chefs as well as the consumer, everybody. There was one other, a little less known chef who also inspired me and I think a lot of my colleagues, and that was Jean-Louis Paladin. And Jean-Louis Paladin came to this country in the early 70s, opened his restaurant at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. And Jean-Louis was baffled because there were no farmers, fishermen, foragers, or gardeners that really connected with chefs. And in his own way, he enlightened us in the same way that Alice did, in being able to encourage chefs to reconnect to the suppliers that are bringing us those extraordinary ingredients. So between the two of them, they ignited what I believe we have, the resurgence of the farmer, the fisherman, the gardener, and the forager. Remember, it wasn't that long that we missed it. It was my generation that kind of missed that. My grandmother, when I lived with my grandmother, we had the milkman that came. We went to the local markets all the time. I mean, there was that true connection to our suppliers, to those people who produced our food. World War II kind of shook that all up. All the men went to the war and the women went to work. After World War II, the men came back and the women stayed at work, and that spawned the convenience food generation, which was us. So we weren't away from it for too long, but long enough that so many of us forgot how important it was. And it's really refreshing to see how much that's changed in a short period of time, in 35, 40 years. It's extraordinary what we have available to us, and how important our farmers have become. And really, they are the true superstars of our profession. We began, of course, with caviar. I mean, caviar and blini. So they do this extraordinary blini there. It comes out in a beautiful pan. It's just breathtaking to look at. Very classic. The aromas, the butter, and of course you have a tin of caviar and beautiful glasses of champagne. What better way to start a celebration than that? And then, of course, we had foie gras, poached foie gras, warm with turnips, spring turnips, peas, and a beautiful consommé of duck, rich but at the same time light, right? And then, of course, the famous dish that they did, which I saw so many times, was saddle of lamb, renunade, which means that it's a saddle of lamb stuffed with its kidneys, served with palm puree on the side, and asparagus. It's, again, just classic, but just perfectly done. And cheese, the cheese cart always comes by in France, and you have so many selections. And, you know, it's just, at that point, you begin overeating because you want to try each one of them. And of course, then to finish the meal was the famous Marquise au chocolat, the chocolate marquise with the pistachio sauce, something that I made almost every night during my time at Taillevent. It was a perfect meal to celebrate a perfect moment with the best people in the world.